The Talk Station presents Faith Matters, a look at contemporary stories and issues from a faith perspective.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life.
And now, on the Talk Station, Faith Matters.
Good morning, and welcome to Faith Matters on the Talk Station 107 and 1240 AM. We're glad you joined us this morning. My name is Karl Zorowski. I am the pastor at St. Peter's United Methodist Church here in Morehead City. We have with us this morning on our panel Robert Kornegay, the associate pastor at Chapel by the Sea in Emerald Isle, and we've got a special guest this morning, Blake Larson, who is the associate pastor at Liberty Church in Havelock. And our program is brought to you in part by Chapel by the Sea. You can visit them online at eichapel.org. Well, good morning, gentlemen. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Trust everyone is well this morning. This is, of course, Faith Matters. It's a show where we kind of spend some time at the intersection of faith and current events. And there are certainly a lot of current events going on in the world right now, a lot of things to talk about. We're going to begin this morning with an article from CBN News. The article is written by Dale Hurd, and it's entitled, "Nothing is Safe from the Cancel Culture Mob." Okay, Robert, I want to hear you say that, cancel culture.
Okay, canceled culture. No, cancel culture.
The cancel culture mob. Thank you. And the article says, tearing down statues, censoring movies, and banning books. It's all part of the rising cancel culture movement sweeping America. And anyone who disagrees with what is deemed offensive, they're scared into silence, hounded into submission, or fired. The censors have come for children's cartoon Paw Patrol, Gone with the Wind, Legos, the Cracker Barrel restaurant chain, and even a ride at Disney World called Splash Mountain, all in the name of trying to erase the culturally insensitive. It seems nothing is safe from the cancel culture movement. Hollywood stars have even done ads to confess their supposed sins of ignoring racism. Those stars could also be trying to save their careers. A number of celebrities and corporate heads have already lost their jobs for alleged racism or cultural sensitivity. Even the editorial page editor of the liberal New York Times. Now, where this kind of really hits in hard with faith is this next paragraph. It says, another casualty is the Church of the Highlands in Birmingham, Alabama, with 60,000 attendees. They will no longer be able to meet at local high schools after the pastor liked social media posts supporting President Trump and was declared culturally insensitive.
Well, I think those paragraphs pretty much summed it up. You know, there's a new phenomenon going on in America. It's called virtue signaling. And we're seeing this sort of erode this whole concept of freedom of speech. And so that people are as the article says, if you happen to have a different opinion about things, there is a real effort to shut you down. And, you know, it's ironic because everyone is saying what we need to do is talk about this stuff. We need to come together and have an honest conversation on what is going on in America and has been going on, whether it's in the black world of Black Lives Matter or whatever it is, you know, that we have to have this conversation. But then when you try to have a conversation with two different sides, one gets shut down and they're not allowed to speak or to express their position. I mean, we're seeing even on Facebook and other social media sites, they're starting to close down some sites that that don't fit that politically correct narrative. So we've gone from combining politically correct discussion, which is a one-sided discussion, to now having to give almost a communist China time where you have to confess all your sins that you've ever done before people. This cultural sensitivity thing has started to run amok a bit, and hopefully this is just a sort of a period that will end, and we can get back to talking to each other.
Well, Robert, you mentioned that it seems like there are no more discussions going on, which is what really needs to happen. And I think the issue is that people are more than willing to speak their opinion. It's just that people are not willing to hear or listen to others' opinions. And it kind of reminds me of when the Pharisees would try to trap Jesus, and they would ask him a question, and instead of listening to his answer and trying to figure out what he was saying, they had already made up their mind what they were going to hear. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of that today. The people are only hearing what they want to hear. But Blake, let's speaking of listening to other voices, Blake, let's hear what you've got to say on this issue.
Yeah, and again, thank you for having me. It's my first time with you guys. I really like what you said about conversations. I mean, they are a two-way thing. We hear this a lot right now. We need to have conversations, but conversations do take multiple people who often have divergent ideas or views, but you listen to each other. And as you just illustrated, that happened even back in the days of Jesus, where they really weren't looking for a conversation. They were looking for an opportunity to make their statement. And it's interesting because I've been blessed to do a lot of counseling. And generally what you look at when there are problems between two people, you say, do you want peace? Do you want resolution? Or do you want to win? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the big dynamic. Do you want to win, or do you want peace? Because once you win and you shut down the other person, what do you do now? Now, what do you do with that? Because the other person has then felt belittled, they felt shamed, and it's really just something that aggravates the whole thing. Actually, just a couple of days ago, there's a Christian artist, by the way, African-American Christian artist named KB. He put out this statement where he said, I just want to remind everybody that cancel culture is not kingdom culture. And he said, we don't just applaud the righteous, we restore the fallen. And yes. I think that's the thing, because we're seeing a couple highly evident examples of real issues and then assuming that everybody's guilty of it. And so when there are people who have fallen into sin or an issue, we should restore them. And that happens through conversation. You can't just cancel the people that disagree with you, and then they want to cancel you because you disagreed with them. And then you cancel the cancelers and everybody's canceled, so to speak.
Great point. Yeah, we used to, have an expression. It's my way or the highway, and that does not lead to coming together and actually trying to find peace over these issues. And you can agree to disagree. What happened to that? And defending the right of others to be able to have free speech. I mean, I grew up when that was a really important part of my education, was that okay, you may disagree with me, I may not like what you're saying, but I'm going to defend your right to say something that might even offend me. But you have that right, as under our Constitution, and really and the principle of free speech is a biblically derived position. God gave us that right of free speech, whether we're speaking right or not. You can agree. You can listen to me all day long and disagree, but that's fine. You have that freedom to disagree and live out the consequences.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think part of the article there that you read, it talks about Chris Hodges at Church of the Highlands. He's the pastor. And if you've ever listened to him, he's one of the least offensive pastors I think I've ever heard. But because he clicked the like button, the little thumbs up icon on a social media platform, now he's in trouble. And it's just ridiculous.
It is. And Robert, we've talked on this show before about how so many of society's ills today seem to come back to the devaluing of human life.
Exactly.
Somebody's opinion is different than mine, so their opinion doesn't matter. Okay, my opinion is more important. That must mean that I'm more important than they are. And I can just shut them down. But that's not what the Bible teaches us.
No, you know,
Jesus tells us to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. That means elevate them to the same level that we elevate ourselves. And that's not what's happening.
You know, it's fascinating that Peter, of all people, would, in his, First Peter would actually say that we are to speak the truth, but to do it with gentleness and respect. I mean, that's the mandate on Christians. And he goes on and says, because then when they accuse you of wrongdoing, they will be ashamed because of your righteousness and the way you live your life. So that's a real important call, is to speak the truth with gentleness and respect.
And the respect is what seems to have gone out the window.
Absolutely. Completely
out the window. So what do we do as pastors to help our people move past this?
Yeah. Well, so many Christians are afraid to speak the truth because they'll have it, it'll be thrown back to them. So we need to encourage them to speak the truth boldly and to be willing to accept the consequences of speaking the truth.
Yeah, there's consequences in speaking boldly, and there's consequences for speaking in love. Because you make yourself vulnerable, but we have to do both, not just one or the other, I think.
That's right.
That is correct. And above all, we need to be good listeners.
Mm-hmm.
And we thank you for listening this morning on Faith Matters. We'll be back right after these messages.
Welcome back to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, and we're delighted to be with you this Sunday morning as you're either preparing to go to your church or drive out to your parking lot or tune in your church online. There's lots of different ways we can do church right now. So we just encourage you to do it one way or the other. Go ahead and prepare and look. We look forward to the second session this morning, and with me are Pastor Karl Zorowski, and Karl's over at the St. Peter's United Methodist Church in Moorhead, and we have Blake Larson, and Blake's over at Liberty Church, and I'm Robert Kornegay. I'm over at Chapel by the Sea in Emerald Isle. And we're looking at another article that's coming out of CBN, their online news program. And it's about this issue of transgenderism, and particularly in the area of sports, Title IX issues. And this has been a real complicated issue in our culture, how we work through this. I know there's been a Supreme Court decision recently lumping this into the Title VII decision that was made. And so we won't get into all the politics of that, but we do want to talk about how it's affecting the athletes and their future, and particularly our female athletes, Title IX athletes, that were protected specifically because all the money was going to other programs. And so this one is titled, "We Line Up Knowing We're Going to Lose." We line up knowing we're going to lose. And that's a quote from a Connecticut athlete, and they're working to restore fairness in their sport. And so, in other words, there are biological males who are identifying as females and are winning all the races in the female sport. So this is out of New Haven, Connecticut, and it's by Caitlin Burke. And I'll just read the first couple of lines, the lead. Recently, the Trump administration threatened to withhold federal funds from Connecticut over a policy that allows transgender athletes to compete in girls' sports. That result is encouraging for female athletes who are fighting for equal competition in federal court. The first time I competed against a transgender athlete was my freshman year at the state open meet. And it was really just confusing. This high school track athlete, Chelsea Mitchell, told CBN News. That confusion grew into frustration as Mitchell went on to compete against biological males her entire high school track career. Now, a graduating senior, she has come up short in 4 state championship events. And she goes on and says, there's been a lot of feelings whenever I race against these biological males that no matter how hard I try, I'm not going to win. We line up knowing we're going to lose, Mitchell said. Okay, gentlemen, this is a complicated issue in our culture right now. You know, as Christians, as Bible-believing Christians, believing that the Word of God has authority and is the source of truth, and the question of biological maleness or femaleness has come gotten gray in our culture. So, particularly in this aspect of this kind of conflict of ideas, if you will, how do we work through this?
All right, I got some thoughts on this. Where does it end? I guess is just really my real question here. Because to me, it's one thing. I understand there are certain people with gender identities. It's one thing in society. It's one thing when you're talking to somebody as a personality, and that can be a different discussion. But it's another in function. And so the way I would look at this is, okay, I have a 5-year-old at home. Can I identify as a 5-year-old so that I can win an arm wrestling championship for 5-year-olds? Or maybe can I qualify for a child's discount at a meal and then qualify later on in the day for an early bird special, just depending on how I view myself. How you view yourself is your issue with your maker, but you shouldn't be pushing that onto some other people who have no hope of being able to compete, especially in something like a sport here. I'm sure y'all are familiar. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. What is the avenue they have if this is now where they have to compete against a biological male? At what point then do they say, okay, well, we're going to create a biological female league and then get told that they're insensitive because they're being too exclusive? So where does it end?
You make some good points there, Blake. I have often thought just what you're saying. You know, when I go somewhere and it costs me $6 to get my child in, and it costs me $18 to get me in, you know, why don't I just go and identify as a 6-year-old and pay the 6-year-old price? And we know it doesn't work that way. And for those who may be listening this morning who are, in fact, transgender individuals, I'm not discounting what you're feeling or what you're thinking. I'm not discounting that at all, because I'm somebody who, whether I agree with people or not, I'm going to respect them. And I'm going to respect their right to make decisions about their lives and what they do, because, you know, I believe that each of us is created as a very precious child of God, and each one of us has value, and God loves each of us just as much as he loves anybody else, and so I should do the same. But you mentioned something there, Blake, about, you know, how somebody identifies themselves has to do, you know, that's between them and their maker. Where this becomes problematic is when you have somebody who is not a believer. You know, someone who is very focused on their own identity, but does not see themselves as a created being, that does not believe in some great power above that has brought them into life and oversees everything. And so, you know, the fact of non-belief or atheism or agnosticism or whatever you want to call it, that can really muddy up the whole picture.
Where I would draw a parallel there then would be, you know, when you look at people who do wrestling. So wrestling, they have different weight classes, and that's for a reason, because you may have a highly skilled 102-pound wrestler, but it doesn't matter when they go up against a 250-pound guy who probably isn't even well-trained in wrestling, but can sit on him or whatever. So there's a reason why we have weight classes. This is a competitive thing, and it's designed in a certain way. So yeah, society-wise, if they want to make the case that they are female rather than male, that's a whole different thing. But I just think then to force everybody else to then compete on behalf of it in a different way is completely unreasonable.
So what we're looking at here is that athletics has always been based on physical ability and physical traits. You know, if in high school, if I had gone to the football coach and said, I want to try out for the football team, he would have laughed me out of his office. Okay, because I did not have the physical stature, the physical build to be able to play football. He would have recognized that. I recognized that. Okay, but here it looks like this all goes out the window in the, you know, in the argument for fairness. Let's make it fair to this group, but that makes it completely unfair to everybody else.
I think that's the dilemma, isn't it? That when you try to give everybody, be sensitive to everybody's needs, and when you have a conflicting thing like this, look, for many of these young women that are in this case, track and field, you know, this is a scholarship opportunity. This is how they're going to hopefully get into college and be able to pay for their college by excelling in sports. And then when you have this unfair advantage, this biological advantage, it removes them from even competition in many of those. And so it's a real challenge that you know, the administration, obviously the Trump administration, has said, look, this is not fair. I mean, it's this objective truth versus subjective truth. And can we create a list of objective biological standards by which you set up these things, like weight class in wrestling or boxing or whatever it is? And the same applies. You know, I mean, if I read an article recently about a woman who beat the biological male in the race. And so, you know, so I think we have to put up some parameters to be able to work through these kind of things. But, and as the church, you know, we have to defend the position that God created man and woman for a purpose. And if there's a gray area in there, okay, we will allow that gray area. But the principle is each human being is created as an image bearer of God with a particular purpose in life. And so we want to help them discover that.
This reminds me a little bit of when my oldest daughter was in a preschool and they had an Easter egg hunt. And she went out on the playground and went out and collected more eggs than anybody else. When they came in, the mothers who were in charge of the Easter party took all the kids' baskets and put them out in the hall and redistributed all the eggs so it was fair for everybody. Okay.
Oh, my goodness.
Level playing field. And that left me and my wife in the car on the way home trying to explain to our 4-year-old why she lost half of her Easter eggs. You've got to allow people to be able to excel at what they're good at.
Yeah.
Don't change rules halfway through just to make it fair to everybody else.
Well, folks, I know this is an unusual topic. It's one that we need to be versed in. We need to have a biblical position on this. So I'd suggest if you have questions about it, go to your pastor. Talk to your pastor about this and try to come up with the answers. You know, we need to be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is within us. And so that's a preparation part of that.
Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station. My name is Karl Zorowski. I'm from St. Peter's United Methodist Church. With me is Robert Kornegay from Chapel by the Sea and our special guest, Blake Larson, Associate Pastor at Liberty Church in Havelock. And we're glad you joined us this morning. Our next article comes from The Federalist, and it is an article written by Robert Gagnon. The title is Supreme Court Ridiculously Demands Everyone Pretend Sex Differences Don't Exist. And just for the record, if you ever read a word like ridiculously in the title of something, it is an editorial and not
Yes, it is.
even if it's being passed as a news article. But this is an editorial by Robert Gagnon. He writes, by a surprising 6-3 majority that included conservative justices Neil Gorsuch and John Roberts, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled Monday that the prohibition of employment discrimination based on sex contained in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 covers sexual orientation and gender identity. Regardless of whether one approves of this stunning rewriting of legislation, the logic used to justify it is truly astounding. The central argument of Gorsuch and those who joined his Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia opinion was this: an employer who fires an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions it would not have questioned in members of a different sex. Sex plays a necessary and undisguisable role in the decision, exactly what Title VII forbids. This is an absurd argument. It operates on the nonsense premise. There's a lot of editorial words in here, aren't there? It operates on the nonsense premise that if biological sex is a benign and neutral condition of life, so too are any and all actions undertaken by a member of one sex if they would be accepted in the other sex. One must only think analogically to see this as not an acceptable premise. By this reasoning, a man must be allowed to join a professional women's sports team if he shows himself to be equal or better than the women on the team, irrespective of whether the man in question identifies as a woman. I don't even know where to start. I'll turn the mic over to Robert.
Well, I mean, I don't know where to start either, although we can start in the other session we just did, which was a Title VII decision about, this transgender thing. For you're hired in one gender, and then you independently, the employee, decides to become another gender, and the employer decides whether that's okay or not. And so the question is, as I see it, who owns that position? Does the employer own that position? In other words, does that employer have the right to define the characteristics of that position serving in there? And in the case of the funeral home, the employer, who was a Christian, said this would be too confusing for our clients to have worked with a man who suddenly decided to become a female, a male changing to a female. And so the employee was fired. So does the employee determine the characteristics of the position, or does the employer? Does that sound sensible? Is that the point?
I'm not sure how much of this whole article is sensible. No, and that's the thing. So then, to take it one step further, is it, if it's on the employer side, is it the employer, him or herself, or is it who they represent as the employer? I saw that President Trump spoke about this, and he was surprised. He said, here's his quote. He said, "They've ruled. I've read the decision, and some people were surprised, but they've ruled, and we live with their decision. So that's what it's all about. Very powerful decision, actually. They have so ruled." And I get that. And that, by the way, is what's beautiful about our country, is to be able to make these decisions or whatever. But how can we handle that in places that, let's say, are faith-based? Like the very foundation, we're all pastors on this panel. We all work for somewhere that is founded in something that would have something that goes in the complete opposite direction of what this ruling is. So then is it, let's say if there's an issue in a church, does the pastor get sued, or is it the church that gets sued?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it actually goes to the role of the court. Is the role of the court to go back into time to 1964 and redefined a term in 2020 understanding, or do you use the intent of that 1964
law?
Yeah,
Rule.
I mean, is that legislating from the bench? I mean,
Yeah,
this should
that's
actually be
difficult. That's difficult, Robert, because we were, at least you and I were alive in 1964. Okay, I was in kindergarten, so that that ruling did not.
You were not
have
in
any
kindergarten.
impact on me. Yeah, I was in kindergarten in 64.
I was at NC State University.
Okay, well, see, like I said, you're the oldest one here, but how can we today look back on 1964 and say this is what they were saying about today when they wrote this back in 1964? Because
Exactly.
the whole issue of transgenderism, I'm not going to say that it wasn't around in 1964, but it wasn't as much in the forefront of society and the lawmakers and everything else in 1964. So now they're saying, I can look at this, I can say, well, I understand what they were trying to do back then, but can we then just take that law and bend it to fit what we want it to say now?
Well, isn't this part of the cancel culture we were just talking about?
Well, it
that
is.
You're going back and judging people for what they did in the past,
right? And one of the problems that we run into from a faith-based issue is when we start doing this with the writings of the Bible. When we say, well, yes, God said this, but look at our society, in order to make our society a little more palatable to everybody, let's go ahead and say that what God meant was this. And that's where it starts to get a little bit dicey. But then if you try to have those discussions or those arguments, that's where, let's go back to the first section today. That's where people stop listening. Okay, you can't have that discussion with someone who disagrees because they're not going to listen. They've already got their mind made up.
Go ahead, Blake.
Yeah, I think that's the hard thing because, especially for those of us, I mean, if you're listening to this program, I'm going to assume you're probably a believer or at least curious about it. And it's not just good advice, but it's scriptural to say to be slow to speak and quick to listen. And so in listening to people's issues is very crucial in working things out. But this is, again, something that is going to probably push things in more of a one-way direction. Hey, this is what it is, and we don't care what you think about it. I think everybody would agree it's a complex issue. Don't complex issues deserve more conversations than simplistic ones?
Exactly. And that's why we have Congress, we have a legislature, we have elected representatives to be able to work through these issues. And this has come up in the article. It says so that since 68, it's come up several times in Congress, and they've never changed the language. They never update. Congress never updated the language. And so for the courts to act, this is judicial activism at its, in a classic sense, that these judges have read the culture and said, we believe it ought to be like this, rather than what, irregardless of what anyone else has to say about it, or regardless of what anyone else has to say about it. No, that's a great point, Blake.
Sure. And you talk about, can you go back to 1964 and say that this is what they meant? I think obviously you can't, because that wasn't the same issue. It wasn't the same political or societal landscape any more than you can go back to 1776 and tell us, what John Adams and George Washington, would have thought about today's issues. They were set in a certain time that you then build on. And I think for those of us that preach the word, we always try to talk about what happened in the biblical days and talk about what culture was like and how that applied, and how then we can take how it applied then and apply it today. But you have to know where it came from.
The context.
Absolutely.
Sure, and context is critical, absolutely critical. You know, when people a lot of times I'll hear arguments against Scripture. You know, well, look at how they treated women in Scripture. Look at how Paul looked at women. Well, that was the society in which he lived. It's not saying that that's the best way that we should live as a society, but that was the world in which Paul existed, the world that Paul saw around him, the world in which he preached and brought the Word of God. And I think as pastors, that's something we need to think about, is we need to be very wary of the context in which we live, the society in which we live, because that is the audience we've been called to bring the Word to. This is Faith Matters. We're glad you've joined us this morning, and stay tuned after these messages for our final segment.
Welcome back to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, and we're into our last segment now. Historically, we've called this the Sign of the Apocalypse segment, and this is fairly apocalyptic for the folks that are living in this section, this Capitol Hill section of Seattle that the article is addressing. This is from the Christian Post. And with me today are Blake. We have another guest who's a Brian. We have Blake Larson, and also Pastor Karl Zorowski, and I'm Robert Kornegay, and we're talking about different articles in the news. There's so much news today, and it changes so quickly that it's hard to keep up with it sometimes. And so either you're riding on your way to church, or you're brewing another cup of coffee, so you can sit in your lazy boy chair and watch your particular church or some other church on the internet. But this article it's by Melissa Barnhart, and it addresses what's going on in Seattle right now. The Seattle business owner says CHOP protesters threatened to kill him for detaining thief arson. And so obviously this is all over the news. I'm sure you're well aware that the Capitol Hill occupied protest, that's where the CHOP comes from, is a long established section in the heart of Seattle that has been taken over basically by protesters and rioters and in some cases arsonists. And so we have an article here. Let me read this opening lead to it. A Seattle business owner whose auto shop was broken into by a protester that stole money and started a fire in the building says he repeatedly called 911, but police never arrived, even though the business is located outside of the autonomous zone. So this is even more complicated. It's not even in the CHOP area that they've declared to be autonomous. It's outside of it, and someone was trying to break in, steal, and burn the business. So John McDermott, the owner of Cartender, said he and his son were left to defend their business as protesters knocked down a fence at the auto shop and threatened to kill them and their employees if they did not release a man who had stolen money, car keys, and started a fire at their business Sunday night. Now, I don't want to go into all the details of this, but obviously this is a lawless situation, particularly if the police, the Seattle police, are not willing to come in and not even enter the zone. This was outside of the CHOP zone. And so this was a business on outside of it. And so the owners were threatened they evidently captured the person that was doing it, caught him in the act, and then the folks from CHOP came over and tried to release him. to get away. So, what do you think about this? Is this the American city to come? Is this what we're going to see as we defund the police and abolish law enforcement?
Honestly, this sounds like a sequel to me, because it sounds a lot like when you see commercials for the movie The Purge. And I have never watched these, but The Purge is centered around, for a section of time, you can do what you want. There are no consequences. Of course, that means legally. We still have moral consequences. We still have societal consequences that are happening. And I got to tell you, I love my brothers, no matter they are white or black or anything. Black lives do matter, but this is not about that anymore. This is not. This is really about just doing what they want. And I have to tell you, to hear that the mayor would call it the summer of love, I'm not feeling a lot of love in this article. You don't have to go very far into the Bible. You can start at the beginning of Genesis and know that God loves order. There was chaos and he created order out of it. I think one of the things that was most interesting to me about this situation, I don't know if you saw this, but the police did respond to this situation. The chief of police commented on it, but they didn't actually go. They just observed from a distance. And that makes me think about the commercials that you see where they say some businesses will actually help protect your identity, and some will just observe and see if there's an issue.
Right.
I don't want police that are just going to come and say, "Oh yeah, well that happened." I'd like them to be able to step in and help about it. And the fact that this happened outside of the zone is very alarming to me.
This whole thing to me is frightening. We talked last week, I think it was, about how when you watch the news about what's going on in Seattle, you can watch one cable channel and see that it is the summer of love. You can watch another channel and see that it's a war zone. And so, we're being fed two different narratives on what's going on here. But it just seems to me, I have grown up in a society that had law enforcement and had laws that people followed. And yes, at times there were some very great issues, but there was not overall anarchy. And what we're seeing right now is anarchy, a total absence of any responsibility or any authority. And Blake, you had talked about how from the very beginning, God began by making order out of chaos. And what we've seen to see happening in the world, especially over the last month, is we are moving back from order back towards chaos. And people seem to be embracing that chaos and rejecting the order. And do you guys ever feel like sometimes you just wish there was a big reset button that we could just push the button and put everything back, and bring the order back? Well, Blake, you talked about going back to the book of Genesis. God did that very thing in the 6th chapter of Genesis, where it says, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. And what did God do? God hit a big reset button and flooded the earth. Now, the story goes on to tell us that God promises to never destroy the world with a flood again. Well, there's other ways that God could hit a reset button, folks. And I think it's about time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. I mean, I think what we're seeing is a rejection. This can't, I think it all relates back to our first segment, this cancel culture, where anything that existed before now is bad. They've rejected it. They want to cancel it. They want to remove the reminders. When Israel went through different challenges, they would build these stone pillars that would be a reminder of what they had gone through. And that's what history and these symbols that we put up is to do. It's to remind us. But now we're seeing in this age right now that there's a concept that we can remove those reminders and we'll go into this utopian paradise. And there'll
Yeah.
be no more sorrow, no more grieving. And actually, it becomes not utopian, it becomes dystopian. It becomes a nightmare. And in fact, in this article, they interviewed a couple of the people that live in that area. They just live there. They didn't do any of the protesting or any of that stuff. And they're afraid to go out at night, that these foreigners, if you will, these people not from there, have taken over their area. It's terrifying, really, to think about. And the police, politically, it can't be corrected now because of politics. So we really need to pray for our churches and our brothers and sisters in Seattle. There are some, and we need to lift them up and pray that God will make a way of restoring order there.
Absolutely. I think in Ecclesiastes 7 is where God says that through the author that, the wise man avoids all extremes. And so what we're seeing is that there were some problems in some of our law and order system. And so some people have chosen to swing the pendulum over here to say, well, then there will be no law and order. But that's not an answer either. Again, it boils down to having these conversations out of compassion and a genuine caring for one another.
Right. And we as the church, we are blessed to have been placed into a community of people who our basic law is this: love God, love one another. Yes. Do no harm, do all the good we can. And we as a community, I think we have an obligation to show the rest of the world what it looks like for people to live together in a family of peace, to show the world what it looks like when we love one another, when we care for one another, when we provide for one another, where we put one another's needs ahead of our own, one another's desires ahead of our own. And that may sound like a really tall order, but that's what God has called us to do. So we thank you for joining us this morning for Faith Matters, and we will be back next week with another show. God bless each and every one of you.
Thank you for joining us for Faith Matters. To revisit today's program or to find more episodes, visit thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. Give me faith.
Faith Matters is a production of The Talk Station.